December 17, 1944, Elsenborn Ridge, Belgium. The forest floor shuddered beneath artillery fire as Staff Sergeant Robert Collins crawled through frozen mud toward a shallow depression ahead. Snow mixed with dirt clung to his uniform, providing what little camouflage he had against the grey winter landscape. He had been separated from his unit, the 99th Infantry Division, during the initial German assault of what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. His breath formed small clouds that dissipated in the frigid air. The M1 Garand rifle in his hands was nearly as cold as the ground beneath him. Every few yards, he would pause, listening for the telltale sounds of German infantry. The distant rumble of tanks and occasional staccato of machine gun fire punctuated an otherwise eerie silence that had fallen across this section of the forest. Collins had been moving east, trying to reconnect with American lines, when he heard a single shot followed by a muffled cry, not the sharp report of a rifle, but the distinctive sound of a pistol. He froze, holding his breath, straining to hear any follow-up movement. There, a faint rustling to his right, followed by labored breathing. Collins tightened his grip on his rifle and slowly pivoted toward the sound. Through a thin veil of morning mist and pine branches, he made out the form of a German soldier slumped against a fallen tree trunk about 30 yards away. The German appeared to be alone. His Feldgrau uniform was darkened at the left shoulder, and his helmet lay on the ground beside him. A Walther P-38 pistol rested loosely in his right hand. Collins couldn't tell if the man had been wounded in combat or by his own hand. What was clear was that he was severely injured and seemingly unaware of Collins' presence. Standard procedure was clear: capture if possible, eliminate if necessary. The German lines couldn't be far, and lingering meant risking capture or worse. Every instinct honed through months of combat told Collins to either take the German prisoner or bypass him entirely and continue towards safety. Instead, Robert Collins did something that defied military protocol. He lowered his rifle and whispered, "Hold on, I'm coming to help." The German's head snapped up, his eyes widening with a mixture of fear and confusion as the American soldier emerged from cover and approached with his rifle now pointed downward. In that moment, as their eyes met across the blood-soaked snow of the Ardennes, neither man could have imagined how their lives would remain intertwined long after the guns of Europe fell silent. Robert Collins hadn't planned to be a soldier. Born in 1921 in Galveston, Texas, he had been studying engineering at Texas A&M when Pearl Harbor changed everything. The son of a World War I veteran who had served in the Argonne, Collins enlisted the day after America declared war, carrying his father's weathered Bible in his pack. His technical aptitude had initially placed him in artillery, but a shortage of infantry officers led to his reassignment. By autumn 1944, he had already seen action at Hurtgen Forest, a meat grinder that chewed through American units with ruthless efficiency. The experience hardened him, but didn't destroy the fundamental decency his parents had instilled. "War makes animals of men," his father had told him before he shipped out, "but the choice to remain human is always yours." The German soldier, Hauptgefreiter Karl Müller, had followed a different path to that forest in Belgium. Born in Munich in 1920, he had been drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1939. He hadn't embraced National Socialism with the fervor of many his age, but neither had he resisted. Like millions of Germans, he found himself swept into a war machine that demanded compliance. Müller had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west in 1944 as part of the build-up for the Ardennes offensive. The brutality he witnessed in Russia had left him disillusioned, his initial patriotic fervor replaced by a single goal: survival. His letters home, carefully avoiding censorship, revealed a man who no longer believed in victory, only in returning to his young wife and infant son he had never met. When the massive German offensive launched on December 16, 1944, Müller's unit had been among the first wave. They had achieved initial success against the surprised Americans, but coordinated resistance had stiffened. During a firefight that morning, Müller had been separated from his platoon and caught in American artillery fire. Shrapnel tore through his shoulder and side, leaving him bleeding and alone in the frozen forest. Believing himself dying and fearing capture, Müller had considered using his pistol for a final act, not on himself, as Collins initially suspected, but to defend himself if discovered. When the pain became too intense, the pistol had slipped from his grasp. Now, as Collins approached, Müller's military training told him to raise the weapon. His finger trembled on the trigger, but something in the American's posture, the rifle pointed down, the open palm of his free hand, made him hesitate. "Sanitator?" Müller asked weakly, using the German word for medic. Collins shook his head. "No, engineer." He pointed to himself. "Help." He pointed to Müller's wounds. "Hilfe." The limited German vocabulary Collins had picked up during the campaign was enough. Müller's hand relaxed, the pistol sliding to the forest floor. In that moment, amid the greatest land battle American forces would fight in World War II, two enemies made the decision to see each other not as abstractions created by propaganda, but as men, each with a family, a history, and a future worth preserving. Collins knelt beside the wounded German, already reaching for the field dressing in his pack. Outside their small clearing, the Battle of the Bulge continued to rage, a desperate German gamble that would ultimately fail. But within this tiny pocket of humanity, in a vast, inhuman conflict, something remarkable was unfolding, a choice that would echo across decades. December 17th, 1944, 1400 hours, Elsenborn Ridge. Collins worked quickly, his hands steady despite the cold. The German's wounds were serious. Shrapnel had torn through the shoulder and embedded deeply in his side. The field dressing Collins applied would slow the bleeding, but wouldn't be enough. Without proper medical attention, Müller wouldn't survive another night in the sub-zero temperatures. "Kommen Sie mit mir," Collins said in his broken German. "Come with me." Müller understood but shook his head weakly. "Nein, Deutsche." He gestured eastward where German forces were positioned. Being captured meant becoming a prisoner of war, if he was lucky. Stories circulated among Wehrmacht soldiers about summary executions of SS troops by angry Americans, especially after the Malmedy massacre, just days earlier, when SS troops had murdered American POWs. Collins checked his compass, considering their options. American lines were at least 3 kilometers southwest, through dense, contested forest. German positions were closer, perhaps only a kilometer east, but that path would likely lead to his own capture or death. Military protocol was clear. Take prisoners back to your own lines for interrogation. Yet the German's condition complicated matters. Moving him 3 kilometers in his state might kill him. Moreover, Collins himself was at risk of capture, having been separated from his unit for nearly 18 hours. The logical choice would be to take the German's weapons, mark his position on a map, and promise to send medics if he reached American lines. But looking at the fading consciousness in the young German's eyes, Collins made a different decision. "Wir gehen zu deinen Leuten," Collins said. "We're going to your people." The technical details of their situation were stark. Temperature, 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility, 200 yards in clearing, 30 yards in forest. Collins had 3 rifle clips remaining, 2 grenades, and 4 days of K rations. His radio had been damaged during the initial barrage. Müller carried the standard Wehrmacht equipment. His Kar 98K rifle lay several yards away, the Walter P38 pistol now secured by Collins, 3 potato masher grenades in his pack, and a bread bag containing hardtack and dried sausage. Collins fashioned a crude stretcher using his field jacket and 2 sturdy branches. He helped Müller onto this makeshift transport, securing the wounded German's own jacket around him for additional warmth. Before starting their journey, Collins did something unexpected. He placed Müller's unloaded pistol back in the German's holster. "Ein Vertrauensbeweis," he said in rehearsed German, a token of trust. What followed was a harrowing half-kilometre journey through contested forest. Collins navigated carefully, avoiding open areas where they might be spotted by either American or German patrols. Twice they froze in place as German infantry squads passed nearby. Once they heard American voices and the distinctive sound of M1 carbines being readied. Collins understood the multi-layered risk he was taking. By helping an enemy soldier return to his lines, he could be charged with aiding the enemy, potentially treason in wartime. By entering German territory willingly, he risked becoming a POW himself. And there remained the possibility that once they reached German lines, Müller's comrades might simply shoot the American on sight. The technical precision of their movement was matched by the moral complexity of Collins' choice. He wasn't acting out of political sympathy or military calculation, but from a code older than the war itself. His father's words echoed in his mind. "In battle, you learn what kind of man you truly are." After nearly an hour of careful progress, they heard German voices ahead, an outpost of Müller's unit. Collins set down the stretcher and prepared to announce their presence. Müller, now feverish but conscious, grasped Collins' arm. "Warum?" he asked simply. "Why?" Collins considered the question for a moment before answering in English, knowing Müller might not understand the words, but would comprehend their meaning through his tone. "Because somewhere you have a family waiting, just like me." Collins stood, raised his hands, and walked forward with Müller on the improvised stretcher. "Sanitator! Sanitator!" he called out, using one of the few German words he knew would guarantee immediate attention. German soldiers emerged from camouflaged positions, weapons trained on the American. Müller called out weakly, explaining in German that the American had saved him. The German sergeant in charge assessed the situation with narrowed eyes, his MP-40 submachine gun pointed at Collins' chest. For several tense seconds, Collins believed he had miscalculated fatally. Then the sergeant lowered his weapon slightly and nodded to his men. Two German medics rushed forward to attend to Müller, while others secured Collins, not roughly, but with the firm efficiency of soldiers who had just captured an enemy combatant. As the medics carried Müller away, the wounded German called out something to the sergeant. The non-commissioned officer considered for a moment, then approached Collins. "He says you could have left him," the sergeant said in accented English. "Why didn't you?" Collins looked at the German sergeant, noting the Iron Cross second-class ribbon and the weathered face that had clearly seen the Eastern Front. "Would you have left him?" Collins asked. The sergeant held Collins' gaze for a long moment before answering. "Take his weapons," he ordered his men in German. Then, to Collins in English, "Today, you are not our enemy. Tomorrow," he shrugged, "the war continues." As Collins was led away toward a collection point for prisoners, he caught a final glimpse of Müller being loaded onto a proper stretcher. Their eyes met briefly across the clearing, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. In that moment, amid the largest battle American forces would fight in Europe, Staff Sergeant Robert Collins became a prisoner of war, not through the fortunes of combat, but through a deliberate moral choice that defied the logic of warfare itself. January 1945. Stalag Korf B, Mühlberg, Germany. The iron discipline of the Wehrmacht processing system had moved efficiently despite the chaos of the ongoing Ardennes offensive. Collins had been interrogated at division level, then transported eastward through a series of transit camps before arriving at Stalag 4B, one of Germany's largest POW camps housing over 30,000 prisoners from various Allied nations. Life in the camp followed a regimented pattern. Wake up at 0600 hours, roll call at 6:30, breakfast, typically watery soup and ersatz coffee, at 700. The remainder of the day was filled with work assignments, interrupted only by a meagre midday meal and evening count. Red Cross parcels, when they arrived, provided critical supplements to the increasingly sparse German rations as the Reich's infrastructure crumbled under Allied bombing. Collins' engineering background made him valuable to the Germans, who assigned him to maintenance crews repairing camp facilities. This work provided slightly better rations and limited freedom of movement within designated areas, but came with the moral burden of indirectly supporting the German war effort, a common ethical dilemma faced by skilled POWs. The technical details of camp life were precisely documented. Temperature in the unheated barracks often dropped below freezing. Daily caloric intake averaged 1,200 calories, less than half what an active man required. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery and tuberculosis claimed lives weekly. The camp's population density was 1.8 square meters per prisoner, yet within these stark statistics existed a complex social ecosystem. American POWs organized themselves according to military hierarchy, with senior officers maintaining discipline and morale. A robust barter economy emerged, with cigarettes serving as currency. Information networks gathered news from new arrivals and sympathetic guards, maintaining critical awareness of the war's progression. Collins kept mostly to himself, sharing little about how he came to be captured. Among POWs, there existed an unspoken respect for each man's privacy regarding the circumstances of his capture. Some spoke incessantly about their last battle, others maintained permanent silence. Collins fell into the latter category. His silence was not just about the unusual circumstances of his capture, but about a deeper reckoning taking place within. As weeks passed in captivity, Collins found himself contemplating the meaning of his choice in the Ardennes. Had it been an act of mercy or a dereliction of duty? The military code was clear. His obligation was to his own forces, not to an enemy combatant. Yet something deeper than military regulation had guided his actions that day. At night, on his narrow bunk in the crowded barracks, Collins would sometimes replay the decision in his mind, wondering if he would make the same choice again. The answer was always yes, not from bravado or sentimentality, but from a core certainty that transcended the war itself. This internal conviction did not make captivity easier. The physical privations, hunger, cold, disease, wore on him as they did on all prisoners. Collins lost 27 pounds in the first 2 months of imprisonment. His body grew gaunt, his uniform hanging loosely from his frame. But as his physical strength diminished, a different kind of fortitude emerged. He began using his engineering skills to improve conditions in small ways, designing more efficient stoves from scavenged materials, creating a drainage system to reduce flooding in the barracks during thaws, organizing tools and spare parts into a systematic inventory that made maintenance work more efficient. These small improvements caught the attention of both prisoners and guards. A German engineering officer, reviewing Collins' work on the camp's water system, commented in halting English, "In another world, we would be colleagues, not enemies." Collins considered this statement carefully. "In this world too," he replied, "just on different sides of a wire." The German officer studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. The next day, a technical manual on water purification appeared on Collins' bunk, a small gesture of professional respect that transcended national boundaries. In late January, as Soviet forces approached from the east, Collins noticed increased activity among the German guards. Documents were burned, records destroyed. The camp commandant, an old-school professional soldier rather than a Nazi ideologue, began negotiations with American senior officers about an orderly transfer of prisoners to prevent chaos when liberation came. It was during this period of transition that Collins was approached by a German medical orderly who spoke in halting English. "Hauptgefreiter Müller sends this," the orderly said, slipping Collins a folded paper before quickly walking away. The note was brief, written in carefully composed English. Staff Sergeant Collins, I am recovered and stationed at Leipzig. My family knows what you did. If we both survive, find us in Munich. Müller, Karl, thanking you for my son's father's life. Collins carefully destroyed the note after memorizing the information. Communication between prisoners and German military personnel was strictly forbidden, and discovery could have severe consequences for both men. As the Eastern Front collapsed and Soviet forces drew closer, the Germans made the decision to evacuate Western Allied prisoners toward American lines to avoid their capture by the Soviets, a humanitarian gesture amid the dying Reich that likely saved thousands of lives. In February 1945, Collins and other American POWs began a westward march in bitterly cold conditions. Many died along the route from exposure, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Collins survived by helping weaker men, sharing his engineering knowledge to improve shelters, and maintaining the quiet resolve that had defined his military service. After 3 weeks of marching, Collins' group encountered advance elements of Patton's Third Army near Chemnitz. The war, for Staff Sergeant Robert Collins, was over. During debriefing by military intelligence officers, Collins provided valuable information about German defenses and conditions within Germany. When questioned about his capture, he offered only the bare minimum. Separated from unit during initial Bulge offensive, encountered enemy patrol, surrendered when outgunned. The abbreviated account satisfied the intelligence officers, focused more on actionable information than on the details of one sergeant's capture. Collins received medical treatment, rest, and eventually rotation back to the United States in April 1945, 1 month before Germany's surrender. The reckoning that had begun in captivity continued as Collins returned to civilian life, a process of integrating his wartime experiences into a coherent understanding of himself and the world. Unlike many veterans who struggled to reconcile battlefield actions with civilian ethics, Collins found that his defining wartime moment actually affirmed rather than contradicted his deepest values. This integration, however, did not translate into stories told at veterans of foreign wars halls or family gatherings. Like many men of his generation, Collins maintained a public silence about the war that reflected not trauma, but a certain inexpressibility, the recognition that some experiences resist translation into casual conversation. June 1945, April 1965, Galveston, Texas. Robert Collins returned to Texas changed in ways both visible and invisible. The physical changes, the weight loss, the premature gray at his temples, the slight limp from frostbite suffered during the POW march, would gradually fade. The invisible transformations would prove more enduring. He resumed his engineering studies with a focused intensity that impressed his professors. The technical precision required by engineering suited Collins' temperament and reflected lessons learned during captivity, that small details, carefully attended to, often made the difference between success and failure, sometimes between life and death. In 1946, he married Sarah Mitchell, his pre-war sweetheart who had waited for him through 3 years of separation. Their wedding was simple, a reflection of post-war austerity and Collins' preference for straightforward ceremonies. Only during the exchange of vows did his voice falter slightly, the weight of promises carrying deeper resonance for a man who had seen how quickly life could unravel. Collins graduated with honors in 1947 and joined a firm specializing in irrigation systems for the expanding agricultural industries of the American Southwest. His designs, characterized by efficiency and resilience, earned him a reputation as an engineer who understood that systems must withstand not just average conditions, but extreme ones. In 1947, their son Michael was born, followed by daughter Eleanor in 1949. Collins proved a devoted but somewhat reserved father. He taught his children practical skills, how to use tools, read maps, solve problems methodically. He told bedtime stories, but never about the war. When Michael asked, Collins would simply say, "I just did what needed doing, like everybody else." The note from Müller remained locked in Collins' memory, an address in Munich and a promise unfulfilled as post-war tensions solidified into the Cold War, making civilian travel to Germany difficult and communication unreliable. Life moved forward. The silence about that day in the Ardennes forest remained unbroken, but silence is not the same as forgetting. Every December 17th, Collins would become quiet, spending time alone with his thoughts. His wife recognized the pattern but never pressed for details. She understood that some experiences resist translation into words, not because they are too painful to recall, but because they are too profound to reduce to language. This annual ritual was Collins' private commemoration, not of combat or captivity, but of a moment when clarity had emerged from chaos, when humanity had asserted itself amid inhumanity. On these days, he would sometimes take long walks along Galveston's beaches, watching the Gulf's waves and considering the strange symmetry of life. How a single decision in a Belgian forest had shaped everything that followed. In the broader American culture, World War II gradually transformed from recent trauma to foundational narrative. Hollywood productions presented sanitized versions of combat. Political speeches invoked the good war as shorthand for moral clarity. Veterans, organizations, preserved camaraderie while sometimes simplifying complex experiences into more comfortable patriotic templates. Collins participated in none of this myth-making. He joined no veterans' groups, attended no reunions, collected no memorabilia beyond the tarnished Wehrmacht belt buckle he kept in his desk drawer, a private reminder of a public conflict's human dimension. This reticence was not unique to Collins. Many combat veterans maintained similar silences, creating what historian Studs Terkel would later call a powerful but unspoken common experience among men of that generation. What distinguished Collins was not the silence itself, but what lay behind it, not trauma or shame, but a kind of completed understanding that required no external validation. As the years passed, Collins advanced in his career, eventually becoming chief engineer at his firm. His designs brought water to previously arid regions, transforming landscapes and economies across Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. He took quiet satisfaction in this work, creating systems that sustained life rather than destroying it. The Collins family flourished in post-war America's expanding prosperity. Michael showed aptitude in both academics and athletics, while Eleanor revealed artistic talents that surprised her practically minded father, but which he encouraged nonetheless. Sarah taught elementary school, her natural empathy making her beloved by generations of Galveston children. In the background of this American success story, international tensions ebbed and flowed. The Berlin airlift, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the early stages of Vietnam. Each crisis sparked conversations at the Collins dinner table. During these discussions, Robert would listen more than speak, offering measured perspectives that sometimes confused his more passionate teenage children. "Oh, how can you be so calm about this?" Michael once demanded during a heated discussion about the nuclear arms race. "Don't you understand what's at stake?" Collins looked at his son for a long moment before answering. "I understand exactly what's at stake. I've seen what happens when nations convince themselves that enemies aren't human." It was as close as he ever came to referencing his defining wartime experience. The comment silenced the dinner table temporarily, creating a space for reflection that was Collins' most consistent parenting technique. As Michael approached draft age in the early 1960s with the Vietnam conflict intensifying, father and son had more frequent conversations about military service, duty, and conscience. Without explicitly referencing his own experience, Collins conveyed nuanced perspectives that defied easy categorization as either hawkish or dovish. "The problem with war," he told Michael during one such conversation, isn't that it creates monsters. It's that it creates situations where ordinary people must make impossible choices with incomplete information. Like what? Michael pressed, sensing an opening into his father's closely held past. Collins considered the question, then answered obliquely, "Unlike deciding whether your duty to your uniform outweighs your duty to your humanity." For 20 years, the connection between the American engineer and the German soldier remained dormant, a single thread in the vast tapestry of post-war silence that defined a generation of men who had seen too much and spoke too little. Then, in May 1965, an envelope arrived bearing German postage stamps and addressed to Staff Sergeant Robert Collins. The formal military rank, unused for 2 decades, immediately distinguished this letter from routine mail. The silence was about to break. May 1965. Galveston, Texas. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, bearing German postage stamps and addressed in precise handwriting to Staff Sergeant Robert Collins. The formal military rank, unused for 2 decades, immediately distinguished this letter from routine mail. Robert Collins, now 44 and a respected civil engineer, recognized its significance immediately. His hands, which had designed irrigation systems across 3 states and cradled his children as infants, trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. The letter inside was written in careful, textbook English. "Dear Staff Sergeant Collins, my name is Thomas Müller. I am the son of Karl Müller. My father passed away 3 months ago from complications related to his war injuries. Before he died, he told me the story of a forest in Belgium and an American soldier who chose mercy when others would have chosen expedience. I was born in October 1944, 2 months before you and my father met. He always said that 2 men gave me my father, my grandfather who gave him life, and you who preserved it. Every year on December 17th, our family has observed what my father called Collins Day, though we knew nothing about you beyond your name and rank. Among my father's possessions was a notebook containing his attempts to locate you over the years. The Cold War made his search difficult, but he never abandoned it. As his final request, he asked that I continue. I am now a doctor at the University Hospital in Munich, with a wife and a young son of my own. If this letter finds you, know that a family across the ocean has spoken your name with gratitude for 20 years. With deepest respect, Thomas Müller P.S. My father wanted you to know that he kept your field dressing as a reminder that humanity can survive even the worst of times." Collins read the letter twice, then sat in silence at his kitchen table. Sarah found him there an hour later, the letter before him, his eyes distant. "Robert," she asked softly. "There's someone you need to know about," Collins replied. That evening, for the first time, he told the full story of December 17th, 1944, the wounded German, the decision to risk everything to return him to his lines, the brief captivity that followed. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Sarah asked when he finished. Collins considered the question carefully. At first, because it felt like betrayal, helping a German soldier when our boys were dying. Later, because it seemed unfinished somehow, like a story without an ending. The Collins family gathered that night. Robert, Sarah, their 18-year-old son Michael, and 16-year-old daughter Eleanor. Robert read Thomas Müller's letter aloud, then answered their questions with a forthrightness that surprised even his wife. "Would you do it again?" Michael asked. The young man was of draft age, with Vietnam looming on the horizon. "Yes," Collins answered without hesitation. "War asks many things of you. Courage, sacrifice, sometimes your life, but it never has the right to demand your humanity." Collins wrote back to Thomas Müller the next day, a 4-page letter that began formally, but gradually assumed the tone of one speaking to family. He included a photograph of himself with Sarah and their children, and asked questions about Thomas's life, his father's post-war years, and his medical practice. What followed was a correspondence that bridged continents and cultures. Letters exchanged monthly revealed the parallel paths of two families shaped by a single act of mercy amid history's most destructive conflict. Collins learned that Karl Müller had survived his wounds and spent 3 months in a military hospital before being deemed unfit for further combat service. Assigned to administrative duties in Leipzig, he had witnessed the collapse of the Third Reich from a desk rather than a foxhole, a twist of fate that likely saved his life as casualty rates soared in the war's final months. After Germany's surrender, Müller had returned to Munich to find much of the city in ruins. Reunited with his wife and infant son, he had rebuilt his life as a postal worker, raising 3 children in a Germany struggling to reconcile with its past while building a new future. Thomas's letters painted a portrait of a quiet, dignified man who had never embraced the Nazi ideology but had served his country out of duty rather than conviction. Karl Müller had joined no veterans' organizations, claimed no war glory, and spoken of combat only when necessary to explain the shrapnel fragments that sometimes worked their way to the surface of his skin decades after the war. The one exception to his reticence was the story of the American engineer who had found him bleeding in the snow. This story he told freely, to his children, to friends, even to American tourists he encountered in his postal duties when relations between the former enemies normalized. "My father believed," Thomas wrote in one letter, "that your action proved something essential about humanity, that compassion could survive even the machinery of industrial warfare." This belief gave him hope for Germany's future when little else did. In autumn 1965, the correspondence took an unexpected turn. Thomas Müller wrote that he had been invited to a medical conference in Houston the following spring. Would it be possible, he inquired, to meet the Collins family? The letter arrived as the Vietnam conflict intensified. Michael Collins had received his draft notice and would report for induction after completing his current semester at university. The parallels between generations were not lost on Robert Collins, as he wrote back with an immediate and enthusiastic acceptance. For the first time in decades, Robert Collins began speaking openly about his war experiences, not just the encounter with Müller, but the broader context of his service. He described the mud of Hürtgen Forest, the camaraderie of the 99th Infantry Division, and the complex emotions of a POW watching the collapse of Nazi Germany from behind wire. It was as if the prospect of meeting Karl Müller's son had unlocked a vault of memories, not through dramatic catharsis, but through the simple permission to acknowledge that these experiences were part of who he had become. The technical precision of engineering had shaped Collins' post-war life, but it was the moral precision of that decision in the Ardennes that had defined his character. Now, as his own son prepared for military service, Collins found himself able to articulate what had previously remained unspoken. Sometimes, he told Michael during a conversation about military service, the most important orders are the ones you give yourself. Chapter 7. The Meeting and Legacy. April 9, 1966. Houston, Texas. The terminal at Houston International Airport hummed with activity as flight LH-490 from Frankfurt arrived at Gate 17. Robert Collins stood with his family, watching passengers emerge from the jetway. His son Michael, now in Army uniform having completed basic training, stood at his side. Sarah and Eleanor completed the family grouping, all eyes searching the crowd for a face they knew only from a small photograph enclosed in a letter. "That must be him," Eleanor said, pointing toward a tall man in his early 20s carrying a leather briefcase. Something in his posture, the straight back, squared shoulders, reminded Collins of the military bearing that becomes ingrained and never fully disappears. Thomas Müller spotted them at almost the same moment, his face breaking into a smile of recognition. He approached with quick strides, extending his hand first to Robert Collins. "Sergeant Collins," he said in perfect English. "At last. Just Robert now," Collins replied, taking the younger man's hand in both of his. "The war's been over a long time." The initial awkwardness dissolved quickly. During the drive to Galveston, Thomas proved to be an animated conversationalist, asking questions about Texas landmarks and sharing anecdotes about his medical practice in Munich. Michael and Thomas discovered a shared interest in jazz, while Eleanor was fascinated by Thomas's descriptions of post-war Germany's reconstruction. It was only after dinner at the Collins home, when Sarah and Eleanor had tactfully retreated to the kitchen and Michael had excused himself to make a phone call, that the two men addressed the connection that had brought them together. "I brought something," Thomas said, reaching into his briefcase. He removed a small wooden box, its surface polished by years of handling. "My father wanted you to have this." Inside the box lay 3 items: a faded field dressing with bloodstains still visible on its fabric, a worn compass of American manufacture, and a black-and-white photograph of an older man in a postal worker's uniform standing with a woman and 3 children. "The dressing, you know," Thomas said quietly. "The compass was my father's way of saying you helped him find his direction in life. And this," he touched the photograph, "was taken on my parents' 20th wedding anniversary in 1963, a day my father never expected to see when he lay bleeding in Belgium." Collins studied the photograph. Karl Müller's face showed the lines of age, but Collins could still recognize the wounded soldier from the forest. What struck him most was the normality captured in the image, a family gathered for a celebration, no different from millions of others across Europe and America. "He looks like he found happiness," Collins said. "He did," Thomas confirmed. "Despite everything, the war, his injuries, the difficulties of rebuilding, he lived a good life. Simple, but good." Collins reached into his desk drawer and retrieved a small object wrapped in cloth. "I've kept this," he said, unwrapping a tarnished Wehrmacht belt buckle. "The guards at the POW camp let me keep it. I never knew why I held on to it all these years." Thomas took the buckle, his fingers tracing the Gott mit uns inscription. "God with us," he translated softly. An odd thing for soldiers to wear while trying to kill each other. "That thought occurred to me more than once in captivity," Collins admitted. "It made me wonder if God was watching all of us fumble around in the dark, hurting each other out of fear and ignorance." Thomas returned the buckle to Collins. "Keep it. It's part of your story now, not ours." The conversation flowed more freely then, moving beyond the careful politeness of their correspondence into deeper reflections. Thomas shared his father's complicated relationship with Germany's past, the shame of Nazi atrocities balanced against pride in the country's post-war democratic transformation. Collins spoke of his struggles adapting to civilian life after captivity, the nightmares that had eventually faded, and the way memory transformed with age. When Michael returned to the room, the conversation shifted again. The young American soldier, weeks away from potential deployment to Vietnam, found himself engaged in a discussion about war with 2 men shaped by its previous iteration. "What did your father think about the new Germany and America becoming allies?" Michael asked. "He welcomed it," Thomas replied. "He used to say that enemies are often just friends who haven't met yet. Your father proved that to him." Later that evening, Thomas presented the Collins family with gifts from Munich: a cuckoo clock for the house, a fine fountain pen for Robert, a silk scarf for Sarah, books for Eleanor, and for Michael. A carefully wrapped package that turned out to contain a medical kit. "My father insisted," Thomas explained. "He said every soldier should carry the best medical supplies possible. This is what our doctors use now." The practical gift carried profound symbolic weight. Michael Collins accepted it with appropriate gravity, understanding that it represented not just Karl Müller's gratitude, but also his hope that compassion might survive in the next generation's conflict, as it had in his own. The visit lasted 3 days. Thomas attended his medical conference while the Collins family showed him Texas hospitality in the evenings. On the final night, they gathered for a photograph, the Müller family represented by Thomas, the Collins family complete for what might be the last time before Michael's deployment. As they prepared to say goodbye at the airport, Thomas handed Robert Collins an envelope. "My father wrote this for you years ago, but never found a way to send it. He asked me to deliver it personally." The letter inside contained just 3 sentences in careful handwriting. "You acted as if there were no sides, only men. I have tried to live by this lesson. My son will carry it forward." The 2 men embraced, transcending the formal handshakes of their first meeting. "Your father said to find him in Munich if we both survived," Collins said. "I never did." "But I found you," Thomas replied. "And now our sons have met as friends." As Thomas Müller's plane departed for Germany, Robert and Sarah Collins stood with their son, watching until it disappeared into the clouds. 3 generations connected by a single act of mercy in a Belgian forest. A moment when one man had chosen to see an enemy as a human being deserving of life. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked her husband. Robert Collins placed his arm around his son's shoulders. "That the choices we make in our worst moments determine who we become in our best ones." The connection between the Collins and Müller families grew deeper over the subsequent decades. What began with letters evolved into regular phone calls as international telecommunications improved. Michael Collins served his tour in Vietnam and returned safely, influenced both by his father's example and the German medical kit that accompanied him through his deployment. He became a history teacher, dedicated to helping young people understand the human dimensions of events too often reduced to dates and statistics. Thomas Müller's medical career flourished in Germany. He specialized in trauma surgery, his choice of profession shaped by his father's experience. In the 1970s, he helped establish one of Europe's first programs dedicated to treating post-traumatic stress in both military veterans and civilian survivors of violence. The children of both families grew up with the story of the Belgian forest as a foundational narrative. When Eleanor Collins' daughter asked for help with a high school history project on World War II, her grandfather finally recorded his experiences in a detailed written account that was later donated to a veterans' oral history project at the local university. In 1984, 40 years after their fateful meeting, Robert Collins finally traveled to Munich. At 63, he had retired from engineering but remained actively engaged in community projects. The Berlin Wall still divided Germany, but the Cold War had thawed enough to make civilian travel straightforward. In Munich, he visited Karl Müller's grave, where Thomas had added a small inscription that read simply, "Saved by Mercy, 1944. Later, at Thomas's home, Collins met the 3rd generation of Müllers, Thomas's children who had grown up knowing the story of the American soldier as part of their family's history. The oldest, a university student named Karl after his grandfather, spoke with Collins about his plans to enter the diplomatic corps. "My grandfather and father taught me that building understanding between nations is the only way to prevent more stories like theirs," the young man explained. As Cold War tensions gradually eased in the late 1980s, the story of Collins and Müller found a wider audience. A German journalist, interviewing Thomas Müller about his medical work with NATO, learned of the connection and wrote a feature article that was subsequently picked up by American publications. The story's resonance in both countries reflected a growing desire for narratives of reconciliation as the Cold War's absolutes began to dissolve. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Thomas called Robert immediately. "This is what my father hoped for," he said, "that enemies could become friends not just as individuals, but as nations." The Gulf War in 1991 prompted another significant exchange between the families. Michael Collins, son James, having followed his father into military service, was deployed with American forces. Before his departure, he received a package from Munich containing a modern medical kit and a letter from Thomas Müller reminding him of the legacy he carried. In December 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, Both families gathered in Belgium. Standing on Elsenborn Ridge, now peaceful under winter snow, Robert Collins, at 73, still straight-backed, but with hands gnarled by arthritis, pointed out to his grandchildren approximately where the encounter had taken place. "It looked different then," he explained. "The trees were shattered by artillery. There were shell holes everywhere. The snow was dirty with soot and blood." One of Thomas's grandchildren, a girl of about 10, asked the question children often pose about war. "Were you scared?" Collins considered the question carefully before answering, "Yes, but sometimes being human is more important than being afraid." Robert Collins passed away peacefully in his Galveston home in 1997, age 76. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his engineering achievements, his military service, and an extraordinary act of mercy during the Battle of the Bulge that connected two families across continents for more than 50 years. Thomas Miller traveled to Texas for the funeral, where he delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of Collins' legacy. "My father always said that in the darkest moment of his life, he saw the best of humanity in the face of his enemy." Robert Collins showed that even in war, we can choose to see each other as men first and adversaries second. The connection between the families continued into the 21st century. When Thomas Müller died in 2012, Michael Collins spoke at his funeral in Munich. Email and social media allowed the younger generations to maintain connections their grandfathers could never have imagined possible. In 2019, 75 years after that day in the Ardennes, members of both families, now in their third and fourth generations, gathered again at Elsenborn Ridge. Among them was Lisa Collins, Michael's granddaughter, who had recently completed a documentary film about her great-grandfather's story. "What strikes me most," she told a Belgian journalist covering the anniversary, "isn't just that my great-grandfather saved Thomas's father. It's that they both refused to let that moment be forgotten, not as a war story, but as a human one." The journalist asked what lessons she hoped people would take from her film. Lisa Collins glanced at Marie Müller, Thomas's granddaughter who had become her friend despite living an ocean apart. "That enemies are often just friends who haven't met yet," she replied, echoing Carl Müller's words from decades earlier, "and that the choices we make in our worst moments determine who we become in our best ones." In the forest of the Ardennes, now peaceful for over 7 decades, the legacy of a single act of mercy continued to ripple outward, a testament to the enduring power of seeing the humanity in others, even across the artificial divides of conflict. They had been enemies for one day in December 1944, and through their descendants, friends for all the days that followed.